Okay, to wrap up the project, we're going to be taking a look at a few different things. The first thing is going to be taking a look at how we can set up our document, change our background just a little bit. We'll look at how we can set up our own custom materials so we can tweak some materials that exist within inside of Zbrush and make our own metal material. We can set up and store cameras so we can get multiple render views, and then we can check the render options to make sure that we've got really nice render quality, and then we can send all these options over to Photoshop. We'll take a look at a Photoshop plugin that exists within Zbrush, and that'll make it really easy for you to take your work, send it on over to Photoshop, and then composite it within that program. All right, let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing I think we should take a look at and talk about is our document size. So you can kind of think of this as a 2D paint program, something like Photoshop, something like that. You have to set a document size for basically how big the piece of paper is that you're going to render on, if you're going to send it to the printer, things like that. So ZBrush has that same kind of concept of a document, and it's got a size to it. So if you go to document up here and you go to this part right here, this is turning on and constraining proportions. Now, if I want to change the values of this to whatever I want, we need to turn that off. I've got a value of 2560 by 1440. That's a pretty decent size resolution for one of my monitors. It's at the same aspect ratio as 1920 by 1080, so it's a 16 by 9 aspect ratio. So again, if you want to change that, you can change it to whatever you want for that particular value. Another resolution that you might want to use if you want to go higher for this is 3840 by, let's go click back on here. So it's 3840, and I'll hit tab to go back down to the next one, by 2160. So that's at that same aspect ratio. And let's say I wanted to use that, and I'm going to click resize, and I'll go ahead and say, do you want to resize the document? Say yes. So what this is doing, it actually took everything and put the document at the resolution that we want, and it's converted everything to pixels. So everything's flat pixels right now. If you want to clear this out, what we're going to be doing is if we go to layer and we go to clear, there's a hotkey for that, and it's Control N. So if we hit Control N, that clears out the canvas. Now if we click and drag out, we're actually dragging out pixel data onto the screen. So this will seem pretty weird. I'm going to show you another thing that's kind of weird. If you hold down the tilde key, which is in the upper left hand corner of the keyboard right next to the 1 key, if you hold that down and you click and drag, you can drag the canvas around and you can keep filling this up, and we can make a repeatable canvas at that point. So again, I think it's a weird feature just because we're using the program as a 3D program, and we don't want any of this really two-dimensional stuff that is going on with the computer right now. You can see that my cursor is actually white as well, and I would encourage you to just try this a little bit just to make sure that you're really comfortable knowing that you're in this mode, because I'm going to show you how to get out of this mode and put it in a different mode. So I'm just holding down tilde key and then dragging this around and just filling up the entire canvas. Now when your canvas is really, really large, if we want to zoom in and out of the canvas like what we do inside of Photoshop, you can see there's a zoom function right here, and there's an actual. If we want to see the actual pixel data, click actual. If you want to see AA half, that's half the resolution of the document, you can click on that. So I'm just going to go click this zoom, and then we got this scroll, and that'll just kind of move the canvas within this document window here like this. So you can see I'm just clicking and dragging out copies of this, and if I hold down the tilde key and then just click and drag, I'm able to fill this in. And like I was saying, this is a way, if you wanted to set up your canvas to like a 512 by 512 or 1024 by 1024, a square canvas, this is a way that you can make a repeating kind of texture out of the 3D data that you have. And so I can just click and drag some of these on the top. And we have live booleans turned on, but in this mode the live booleans is not active for when we drag this out, so that's why the design kind of looks like this. So I think that's enough to kind of drive home this point that we're in this different rendering mode whenever we're doing this like this. So again, if I want to clear this out, I hit Control N, or we can do this up here. We can go to Layer, and then we can just hit Clear, and then I'll clear that out. Notice that the cursor is white, and I want to go into the 3D edit mode here. To do that, we just drag one copy onto the canvas, click this edit, or you can see the hotkey for that is T, and to go into edit mode. And take a look, our cursor is now red, and we've got the 3D model back on screen. We can tap F for this. You might notice that the program's kind of slowed down quite a bit, and that's because we have a really large resolution for our document. It's drawing at that larger resolution, but we're zooming out so we can see that. So unfortunately, it doesn't speed up the program as you kind of zoom out with the canvas like that. The only way to change that is if we go to the document and actually change our actual document size. So the values that I was using before for that was 2,560 by 1440. And I'll just click resize for that. You can see it's going to do exactly what we were doing before. It filled the canvas with that correct size. Drop this to pixels. Our cursor's white. Hit Control N to clear the canvas out. Now we'll click and drag one copy out. Tap T for that. And if I want to tap F, that'll frame in. I'll tap F again just to frame the entire object like that. Okay, so that's going to give you everything you need to know about creating the correct document size. Let's talk a little bit about how we can change some of the background colors and the gradients and things like that. So probably what I should have done before, you saw me kind of fumbling around with the interface quite a bit because this opens and closes. It's not quite so easy to change some of the values and keep this open. So in order to combat that, we can open this up, take this little icon here, click and drag to the left or to the right. Now if you don't see this open, you can double click this little triangle and that'll open and close that particular part that you see here. Alright, this is where we can change our background color that you see here. So we can just click and drag out, and I can drag anywhere around the color picker. We can pick from the background elements that you see within here too, some of the different stuff that maybe is on the shader wall. You can click from any value from here. I was trying to see if I could drag outside the program and pick colors. That would be pretty cool if you could do that, but it only looks like it wants to pick colors within through here. I am kind of curious if we did a see-through for the interface, if it will allow us to do that at that point. Let's see here. I'm going to click and then drag out, and it doesn't look like it's going to allow me to do that. So I was just wondering if we could use that feature to possibly pick through the background. Doesn't look like that's working that way. Maybe I'll choose something that it's probably going to be a little bit more obnoxious, but it's just going to be pretty obvious what we're doing for picking on here. If we want to move this color inside of here around, we can click and drag, and we can get different hues on here this way by moving around within there. And then within here we've got value, and we've got saturation, and we can move it up and down within here. So if we want it lighter, we push up, darker down. If we want it more saturated, push on this side. If we want it less saturated, go over within through here. So we could pick a particular color or push it down something right within here, and then click background and then pick from that color there. So if you want to get a very specific value and you want to use the color picker, it's possible you could do it that way. So I'm just going to put this back to white because that does affect some of my material colors. We'll talk about that in just a little bit about how we can start filling our object with various colors and things like that. So that's going to give us our background color. Now we've got this range slider, and then this is what it's saying for the range for the gradient that it's going to produce. So let's just put it on 1, and that's the highest amount of gradation. If we put it on 0, it's going to kill it altogether. Then we've got this center, and it's set to 0. That's right in the middle of the document. If we push it down this way to 1, it's going to push it down here. If we go 0 like that, it's going to push it towards the top. So let's just put this, I'll put this back down. I'll just leave it maybe at 0.25, somewhere around there. Then we've got this rate that you see here, and this will allow us to, if we got a value of 0, we can do that. If we push it positive, you can see how it takes the gradient and it pushes it white with black, and then the other direction it goes this here. So again, let's just choose a color so we can see what maybe this does. So If we go positive with it, it does the color with the gradient and it pushes white at the bottom. If we go negative, it's got the color with the gradient and it pushes dark at the bottom. This range, you can see it's making a little bit lighter, it looks like, for that. So if I drag this down a little bit, we get the gradient and it's more filling with that color if I do 0.5, and then we change our center. So I'll let you kind of play around with the sliders on that and figure out what you want to get with that. My suggestion to you, if you're going to do this darker thing, think about the value of the object that you are displaying against the background that you want. If you use colored backgrounds, it becomes kind of obnoxious to kind of look at. So unless you're doing something that's very specific for the design and you want a really loud color, I wouldn't suggest that. What I would suggest is maybe you choose a mid gray and start with that. I'm going to drag out for that. I will take this range and just put it at, I'm going to do a very low value like negative 0.25, something like that. And then the center, I'm going to keep it maybe right around there. And then this range, I want it maybe within here like this. I forgot it's also darkening my object as I've got this here. So I think that'll work pretty well for me. So whenever you do File, Save As, it's going to save the document information that we said for what the size is. It's also going to recall what this background color is and the range and the center and all that. So it's going to save with the project. So the next part that I think we should work on is making sure that we got a very good quality, best possible render with this. So as I talk a little bit, let's just hit the BPR button that you see right up here in the upper right hand corner to invoke that. And I'll show you the options that I set for the BPR for this. So really there's nothing too spectacular that I have going on with this, but I do have some what I think is decent shadow information on here. I've got the floor turned on and I've got a floor shadow. I like that to ground an object if we want to ground an object. The other thing is having some ambient occlusion turned on with this, and then I just do a little bit of BPR filtering to basically add a little bit of noise and maybe sharpen up the image a little bit. So let's take a look at that too. So we'll go to renderer and we'll take a look at this for a while. So let's click and drag this over here like this. And not external render, render properties. If we open that up, you can see that I'm going to turn on ambient occlusion right away and have that turned on. And then we'll go to BPR shadow and we'll work on some of the shadow information. These are the values that I like to do. I like to do this 0.5 for floor strength, and you can see this is the value that it's going to give me for the opacity for the floor strength. And then we got this G strength, which is set to 0.5 as well, and that's a global strength, so it turns up or down the darkness of all the shadows within the whole entire render. You can see my shadows right in here, kind of a little bit of a lighter gray. I don't like super contrast shadows. I like them to have enough there to where it pops shapes off, but I don't want it to be super dark. So that's kind of where I like it to be. You can see the resolution. I think that's the default is 4096 for that. If you're doing really large renders, you might have to crank this number up a bit more to not get pixelization on your renders. I set this blur to 14, and then this changes the crisp shadows to having a little bit more softness to them. And then this V depth is actually almost like if you think in Photoshop, if you do contrast or levels within things, this adds a little bit more contrast and it bumps up the whites a little bit, makes the darks a little bit darker in the actual shadow information. I'm trying to think of, if we go here to the BPR render passes, after it's rendered, you can actually get a little tiny snapshot or a preview of what that would look like. If you actually click on those images, you can export them out from the program, but you can see with the shadow information with that -4, you can see everything's pretty light, and then the shadow information is kind of dark. And if that's not set to -4, it might make the object feel just a little bit muddy, I've noticed. So I've always kind of cranked that up a little bit. So let's move on to BPR AO, and you can see I leave the strength on that to 1. The global strength is set to 0.7. I think the angle of this is set to 360 normally, so I put that to 90. I leave the resolution alone on that. I set the blurs like really kind of low for that, and this V depth, put that to -4 as well. And so that gives me pretty decent renders. If we take a look at this and then click over AO, you can just see the amount of ambient occlusion that is kind of generating for that. From there, you can go to the BPR filters. After it's rendered, you can do this stuff live. So if you want to turn this on, you can see we click this little open circle and then take that little middle thing off, and it undoes the kind of grayed out thing, and it opens up these as possibilities for you. You can see I pretty much put a very low amount of noise on here. If we crank that up, you can see what we've got going on here, and we've got a radius that will control the size of this. So if I put that back down to 0, and I think I had this noise set to 21, somewhere around there. Yeah, so that's just going to add a little bit of noise to this. If we go to this one, I've got a sharpen filter on here. So it's just like going into Photoshop and then crispening up things, but you might as well just be able to do that directly inside of ZBrush instead of pushing it to Photoshop. The sharpen value is set to 72. If you wanted to crank up the radius, you could do that. You can see what it's going to kind of do for sharpening. So I'm a little bit careful about that. I really don't want to pull up this contrast on the edges that much on things. So I usually just leave that to 0, and if maybe you're going to push this up, maybe you just push it up to 1, something like that. And again, so sharpen 72, 75, somewhere in that area. But I'll leave that up to you what you want to do with these values. I wouldn't suggest going super high with it. It's just enough to kind of punch things out. And so after it's rendered like that, let's take a look at the next part, and we'll look at how we can use a plugin with inside of ZBrush to push this over to Photoshop. Okay, in this section, we're going to be taking a look at how we use the ZBrush to Photoshop plugin that they've got within their plugins area. So we'll go ahead and go to plugins and then click and drag this over into the interface right here so we can take a look at this. So go to ZBrush to Photoshop right down here. And there's a lot of different options that you can push on here. So if you turn on these, you could render out AO along with the BPR render. You could render out depth. We could put a mask on. If you want to render out polygroup IDs, you can put that on. You can separate out shadows. Sometimes if you want to do some comping, it might be cool to have some spec on there, some specular. You can do subtool IDs. So it takes each subtool and makes a color for that. Object space normal pass. Also lights, we could put that on there. I'm not going to put color bump on there, or best, or albedo. Albedo is just the straight up color information that you have on there, so I'll just go ahead and do that. And then this is a tangent space normal map pass. They do have wireframe, so you can turn that on. Let's just go ahead and click send to Photoshop. Now, before I send it over, the only thing that I feel like I really need if we want to get to the bare bones of what we could do to comp this stuff together and kind of just put together things in a presentation, you can see how this renders out with the BPR render. So if we put it on just BPR, that'll give you that. And if you want to separate it from the background, just turn on mask. So just those two options alone will give you everything that you need. But if you, again, if you want to use this to do some work inside of Photoshop and comp things together and do some extra stuff, you might want to turn on some additional options and check that out. So I'm just going to say send to Photoshop. Now, if this is the first time that you've used the program, it's probably going to give you a pop-up, and it's going to ask you to navigate to where the Photoshop executable sits. Depending on which version of Photoshop that is, that's going to be a bit different for you. You're going to go to, if you're on the Windows, you're going to go to C drive, go to your program files. So yeah, you're going to have to do a little bit of investigation as to where the Photoshop exe sits. Basically, you just got to navigate to that and point it to where that sits. Once that's established, and you only have to do it one time, then it's going to go through this process. So you can see it's rendering behind the scenes. It's rendering all these different passes that we have. Once it does finally load it into Photoshop, it will open up Photoshop for you, and it'll tell you, hey, you're about to ready to run some different scripts, and it's going to build a file for you. Do you want that to happen? We'll go ahead and say yes for that, and then it'll go ahead and load that into Photoshop. It'll quickly build this file. You'll see it kind of build off to the off to the right pretty quickly within your layers area, and so you shouldn't be alarmed by anything that's kind of doing for that. Once that's done, it'll give us some really nice options for giving us folder groups that have all these different parts that we're rendering out, and it'll separate it out into really nice folders within inside of Photoshop, and then it'll make it pretty easy for us to open and close those folders, show or hide some of the different render passes that it's got, and then we'll, like I said, we'll be able to use that to comp things together. So I think it's getting pretty close to being done rendering here. I believe right now that's the subtool ID that it's baking out right now, and looks like this is the tangent space normal that it's baking out currently. I think it already rendered out the spec pass, and we'll see what it's rendering currently. This might be different lighting pass, or maybe it looks like maybe AO and shadow. So we'll see what it does when it's done with this. And so obviously the document size that you have, how large we're rendering this matters. The samples that we had set for the shadow information that we just set, along with AO, all those settings kind of matter for how long it's going to take to render. Now I know as I'm talking through this, it might seem like it's taking a while, but it's rendering quite a few different passes for us, and it's Zbrush is actually pretty quick for what it renders out for this. So I know I feel like I'm just kind of stalling as I talk through this, but this should give you a good indicator of how much time it might take to render this many different passes on here. And I think what it just did was render the AO, and it also rendered the shadow pass. And I believe what it's rendering right now is considered lights. It's putting a few different lighting scenarios and rendering it from like a left, right, top, bottom, maybe a more frontal and rear kind of lighting setup. And again, that becomes kind of nice. It just can become an option that you can use inside of Photoshop, so you could steal one of those renders, and if you wanted to build like your own fake rim light, something like that, it's possible that you could do that. And so I think at this point I've talked enough. I'll just pause it and let it render and finish. Okay, so you can see here we are inside Photoshop, and it's going to ask you if you want to go ahead and run the script that contains everything from Zbrush, and you can see here's the document size that we had, and it's rendered right in the center of the screen, and it takes just a little bit of time to kind of build this folder structure that you see here and render everything out. Okay, and then after it's done, I can close this up. You can see it's going to build a mask for us. It's going to make one master folder at the very top and then hide everything, and that'll give us a solid color on the background. So we can double click on that. We can always change the color to whatever we want this to be on here. So I'm just going to make it black and leave it what it was at before. And then I'll just close up each one of these groups, and then let's take a look at what it kicked out. I'm going to hide everything, and we'll start with the base layers first. And you can see we've got a BPR render like this. The albedo, I just have this set to a white color, so that's why that rendered that out white. Everything was actually just filled with white color. So you could potentially, if you did that, you could use that as a mask, but we kicked out a mask as well. So again, we've got our BPR render like this. And if you wanted to, if you were just doing this BPR render with the background, you can select this folder and hit Control E, and that will merge this down. I'm going to duplicate this real quick just to show you on here. So I could hit Control E like that, and that would merge that down. It would build a mask for us. And if you want to keep the mask, you could. If you want to get rid of the mask and then have it apply, you can click and drag this down to the trash icon. Like, let's do this. Let me try it again. Drag it down to the trash icon and hit apply, and that'll actually apply that that mask to this and knock out the background. So now that is just pixel data, and it's got the background knocked out for this. And we could just move that around and rearrange it on this document, or we could hold down Shift and drag this into like another document, like what I've got here, and I'll just throw this at the very top. And you can see now if I put it on the move tool, I could just move that around and it's a nice clean piece of render in this other document. So I'll just trash that over there real quick. So that's how we can get that. I'm going to trash that. Show this again, and then let's take a look at materials. I don't think I rendered out anything for materials, so even if you don't render some of these passes out, it will put these into the folder structure for you. So I don't need that. I can trash that. And lights, if we turn this on, you can see here's the individual light pass, so you can tell this is what it says what it is. It's a front pass, this is a left, this is a right, back top, back left, and back right. So I would pick out something like this and say that looks like a pretty good render to me for rim light, for the possibility of rim light. So I could select all like this, and what I would do is maybe select this layer, hit Control Shift C to do a copy merged, and then at that point I can make a solid color layer, and I'll just show you this real quick. Let's turn off lights. I'll make a solid color layer, and I'll make it red like this. Then I'll go into the mask that it generates for this. I'll hold down Alt and click on here, and I'll just paste it in. And then if I hold down Alt and then click back on here, you can see what I've got. I've got a solid color layer that I can now change the color of this thing whenever I want. So I really love the solid color layer for that particular reason. And like I was saying, I can change the intensity, how dark it is. I can at will always come back and tweak these things. Now if I want to increase the values of this, I can select the mask that we generated, just hit Control L. That'll bring up our levels. And if I want to crank up the mids for this and then the high end, I could do that. And what I'm trying to do is, just like I said, just generate some rim light data for this. I'll hit OK. And if I showed my base layers, here's our BPR render that we had, and then now we've got this on top of here as just regular kind of blending mode. So we can turn on and off this rim light that we've kind of baked out for that. And again, if I want to tweak through here and change some different colors, and I kind of like the blue. The blue is kind of cool. I just try to choose some colors that are maybe complementary for this. So yeah, maybe I'll go back to this blue kind of color. And now that I have this on here, I could crank the levels. I can select that mask, hit Control L, and start playing around with this to really see what this does for me as far as the values go on here. We could also change the blending mode to set to normal, and if I put this on to something like color dodge, that's really going to brighten it up. Linear dodge or screen, those all lighten and still keep some of the pixel data that's underneath. So maybe screen is a good example to kind of look at, and then I could change the saturation, really crank up the saturation of this, and if I want to make it more red or kind of orange. So I think these combinations look pretty good together. There's a lot of different combinations that I think work rather well with that, but that's at least a workflow that you could use for that. And again, I only used one of the lighting scenarios that it kicked out, so you could try that for many different lighting scenarios, and you could do this with multiple things. So you could have a warm off to one side and a cool color off to the other. That's a nice thing that people do for renders a lot. That adds a lot of visual interest to things. So that's a possibility for you. Let me just hide these and close these up. We'll take a look at geometry and what this kicked out for this. So here's our what was this? Something screen. I can't remember what the actual name of that is. Object screen normal, something like that, maybe is what it was. And what you can do with this becomes interesting too, where if you go to your channels within here and you have it selected, you can see under the red channel equals a direction, green channel equals a direction, and then blue channel equals a direction as well. So if you wanted, you could take this and say, I want to use this as a lighting scenario, or maybe I want this bottom light as a scenario. You can click and drag this off into like a copy for a new channel, and then it'll save that out. That becomes a selection. If you hold down Control, you can click on it, and that becomes a selection for you. So just like we did before with this solid color layer, I'm going to turn this off. I'll go right above it. I'll do another solid color. And then this time I'll choose red. Let's just do that, right? And so it's filling this solid color layer. It's masking it out with this. I'll hold down Alt and click on that. If I hit the levels for it, Control L, we can take the mids and then drag this down here this way. Maybe I take my dark ends like this. So again, it becomes something kind of cool to kind of play around with. That's on the normal blending mode. And if you want to try these different blending modes, you can see multiply. If I click on one of these, I can hit my up and down arrows and I can cycle through them. And that's usually what I do. I usually try to just cycle through these different blending modes and find the one that I think is the most interesting for the way it kind of blends on here. And I saw overlay. Overlay felt kind of neat for that. Again, I was saying with this, if we show this one, add these together, you can see the combination that we've got, and then those are all warms. If I set this one to like a cooler kind of color at that point, you can see what we could get, and we can turn these on and off. So this becomes a non-destructive workflow for you inside of Photoshop for how you kind of blend this stuff together. So let's continue to look at some of these. So that was, I think, the object space normal. We've got our tangent space normal. Again, if we click on this and we go to channels and we take a look at the red, green, and blue, what those equal as far as like a direction. And again, it almost feels like lighting information at that point. We've got depth, and then this becomes pretty powerful. If I select all, I'll do Control Shift C to do the copy merged. This one, if you did this, I think I need to do this real quick. I'm gonna make a new folder, and then I'll make a mask, and I'll just hold down Alt and click on the mask, and I'll hit Control V to paste that in there. So I was trying to think of what I should do because I need another step and I don't want to lose the information that I copied. So now I'm going to select all, do copy merge, Control Shift C, and then I'll paste this into this folder and then push it right in here like that. Nothing should change because I've just copied all the data that you see underneath of here. But now if I do this, if I go to filter and I blur and I do a Gaussian blur, and let's do a pretty nice amount of blur on here, you can see what we can do with this depth information. So wherever it is white, it's actually going to be more blurry, and then wherever it's black, it's not going to be blurry because it's letting that Gaussian blur that I did on this layer show through. So actually what I'd like to do is make it more blurry as it goes away from the camera, so I can hit Control I as we're taking a look at this mask. Again, I held down Alt and clicked on that. And then let's hold down Alt and click back off of that. So you can see what I was saying is now we've got a fake depth of field kind of effect going on where it's blurred in the background a little bit more. And if I want to control that with the levels, I can hit Control L. And you can see I can take this midpoint and I can drag it this way. If I do that, it's going to make it more blurry as it gets closer to the camera. If I want to have it sharper, I could do that. But then maybe I'm kind of dragging up the white end this way and then kind of trying to make that a little bit more shallow for that. So depending on the effect that you want for that, again, you can play around with that. And then again, we can always take these other solid color layers that we did and drag it above that, add this to this information. You can play around with the opacity, kind of knock that stuff back just a little bit. So yeah, so let's see what else there was on there as far as geometry. I think we had the depth, we had polygroup ID. So if we put on the magic wand tool, and I'll tap W for that, and I'll do the click, this magic wand tool with a tolerance that's pretty low. Let's see, and I want to do this. I want to put on a tolerance of maybe 30. Yeah, and that's going to give me pretty good information there at that point. If I hold down Shift, I can add selections to this. So this should just make it really easy for you to make selections, and then you can fill with colors and things like that. You can do the solid color information that I was showing you. So that becomes pretty powerful from a selection standpoint. Then we have subtool ID, so that's going to give us some more information that we could use to kind of select with. The thing that I thought was kind of interesting is you don't have to have the layers visible. You can actually just look at it this way. have it hidden. And you can still use this to do selections. So I'm just holding down Shift and adding those as selections. And so no matter if that's hidden or not. Now, if you have it on sample all layers, it's going to change the functionality of that. It'll sample all the pixels that you see. So be aware of that. So that's everything for geometry. And then if we go to effects and turn that on, we've got shadow information. Let's hide this and let's just make this white. And so you can see shadow is set to multiply already, and it takes the opacity and drags it down. So just keep that in mind. If we put this back to normal, this is exactly what it's kicking out for the shadow render. So it separated that out for us. Specular is set to screen. Let's put that back to normal, and it changes the opacity and put that to 100%. So it renders out this kind of chrome kind of data for you, and you can take that, and usually what you would do is, again, set it to screen. You might want to set it to a screen, change the opacity, hide it all, and then maybe just kind of paint in areas that you want some specular to kind of show through for that. Ambient occlusion is normally set to multiply, and that just makes it darker. So if I got this on multiply, and then let's put this on this base color here, and I'll push this down just a little bit so you can kind of see with just a little bit of color information what that looks like, and then with that as multiply. So we can kind of tweak this with the values and change the opacity, just kind of play around with that just a little bit. And if we go to masks, it's going to generate a black and white mask for us. Like this, it's set to normal. And here's the mask. Hold down Alt and click on it. And then we've got this as a mask as well. So those are all the different options that I use to kind of bake everything out, and you kind of play around with that. Again, I didn't do anything too crazy with mine. I just did a BPR render and then used a mask and kind of flattened that out. So I was getting different camera views and rendering that out. So maybe I got a little bit ahead of myself showing you this plugin, but I think that's going to give you a lot of options to kind of play around with. The next thing I'll show you is how we can set up our own custom camera views and store those so we can always get back to our renders, because that's super important in this process. Okay, here we are back inside of Zbrush, and for this part, let's talk about how we can set up cameras and save camera data so we can always get predictable renders and get back to these camera settings that we set up. So what we're going to do is go to Draw and then click and drag this over to this part of the interface, and you can see that we've got at the bottom down here, we've got these different cameras, and I've got a camera 1, I've got a camera 2, and I got a camera 3 already pre-set up for this already. If you want to set up a new camera, just go ahead and position the thing where you want, and it can be in perspective or not. I'm going to put it on perspective and make sure I've got a perspective shot. I don't have a shot for the back side of this, so I'm just going to position this thing, rotate it in place, hold down Alt, kind of pan this thing around, get it into position where I want it to be. And if I need to zoom in just a little bit, I can control right click and zoom in for that just a little bit. So I've got that in the position that I want, and I'm just going to hit Store Cam. Now it's going to ask for a name. I've already called this camera _001 through 3, so it's real easy for me just to hit the arrow key, hit a backspace, tap 4, and hit enter. And now I've got a new camera position saved. So this becomes a new camera that I should be able to click in the stack that you see within here. This will take you through the previous camera or the next camera in the list, so you can just go and cycle through those. Now, if you want to rename a camera, you can go ahead and rename the camera by selecting it and then clicking rename. If you want to delete the camera, you can delete the specific camera that you have. And then if you click all, that's going to remove all the cameras that you see within there. So that's going to save with the project data as well, and that's going to allow you to always come back, make sure you've got predictable results for getting back to the renders that you have. Now this does matter for how things are laid out with this document size that we went over earlier, so just kind of keep that in mind. On the interface that I've built, I use this quite a bit, so I've put some of the camera data information just up here. So mainly I'm just cycling through the cameras and then maybe storing a camera. So I've put that up there on my interface. Okay, the last part is us talking about color and material information. And really, this should have probably come before the rendering part and everything else like that. But I don't think it really matters too much about which order that you do. You might want to do some rendering before you get to this part and maybe think about filling colors, because you might just be filling this with just pure gray, or kind of looking at the material that we've looked at with before, which is the matte cap gray. And so if we don't have any material or color information filled on our objects, we can go through and we can change all the different material types, and we can change what color information that we have on our model, and we can change this at will. And so that's a nice feature. It's good to have. But what I'm going to show you now is how we can fill materials and colors that are specific, and then they stay. So you can see as I do this and I change these materials to these different material types on here and change the color, you'll notice that the orange on these objects is not changing, and that's because they've been filled with white color, and then they've been filled with a particular material type. So that's what we're going to take a look at now. If I put it on flat color, that's another way that you can see what this color information has actually been filled with, and because it changes, not been filled with anything. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and put it off this flat color. I'll put it on the matte cap gray, just like we've got going on here. And let's start with just one object. We can go with this this piece here. I'm going to hold down Alt and click on it. And I'm going to put it on the standard brush. It really doesn't matter which brush type that we have. All the brushes have access to this. And you can see that this is material channel, this is RGB channel, and then this is material with RGB. And so if we put this on just M for material, and we chose a different material on here, and then we say fill object, and that's on my interface, it actually sits under color. And let's just take color and then dock it over here. So we see I just stole it from this area and said fill object. So now I filled it with this material. And so as we change this to the matte cap gray, you can see that that material type is going to stay to this red wax material that we put on here, like that, right? Now it still has that functionality where it should change color for us, but it doesn't really look like it's actually doing that, which I'm kind of surprised about that. But if we want to change the color information, we can go to RGB and then we can put on a color, and I'll just say fill object, and now it's filling with the particular color that we've got here. And if I want to fill object with this gray, or if we want to fill it with black, we can fill it like that. So the color along with the material is going to give you the final look for that particular thing. If you want it to be purely what that material type is, just put it on pure white like this. Now you see that I'm filling with just RGB and it's not changing the material. Now if I want to fill with color information and I want to fill with the material all at the same time, I can put it on an mRGB and say fill object, and you can see I'm doing that at that point. And what I'm doing is filling with this matte cap gray, and then now I'm filling with whatever color that I'm going to pick on here. So you can see that, and as I reset that back, it's going to do something like this. Okay. What I found for the metallic parts on these things is this reflected foil, which was down in this area within here. If I select this, and if I choose white and say fill object for that, you can see what we've got going on for that. And we could choose a different one if we want. I'm just going to double tap. I accidentally select that to move the lighting in the back. So if you double tap this little lighting icon, and pushed it in the back. So that was giving me some weird results, so I had to just kind of fix that real quick. So if we take a look at this, if we want to change this material type, we could fill it with this. We could say mRGB, put it on white, and put it on this reflected foil, and say mRGB, and then say fill object, like this. And then I'm going to go to my materials, and I'm going to click and drag this over. So I've modified this a bit. I'm going to hide the color one right now. You can see on this material, if we go to modifiers, it's got two different slots for this material. Some of the materials you'll find will only have one slot. Some of them have two. It's possible to fill with 4 different slots on here. So it's possible, these are like, each one of these slots is like a material in itself, and you can fill or copy from one. So if you see this copy SH and you copy it from this material, you could go in and find, you can find another material that's got multiple slots. If you go down here, this one's got a double shade, this is a tri-shader or a quad shader, so you could always get to these, and these have multiple slots open. Let's just go to this double shade on this one here, and you can see on this one I can go to these 2 different slots, and if I took that one that I copied from the other material that we were in, the foil material, we can say paste SH, and you can see how I pasted it into here. Now I could paste it into both slots, but it's going to get rid of all this information on this other side that you see here, like that. If I undo, it's not going to undo in here. So you got to be kind of careful with this. So if, again, if I wanted to steal something from like another material, I could copy the information from this and then go to back to this double shader and then paste in here. And you can see how I could start to mix these things together. The mixer area that you see here let you mix these different materials together at that point. So I would say that the materials within ZBrush are they're pretty confusing. So I'm gonna just try to show you some limited information. I at least want you to know that this is possible that you could do this. So if you want to try to play around with it, you're free to play around with it. But I'm just going to kind of show you. I'm going to go back to this reflected foil and show you some of the things that I did and I modified on there. So I at least want you to know about these slots, because what we've got at this point is the ability to go and change some of the reflectivity and things like that. So I'm going to put this back on white. We've got this reflected foil. We've got this part here, fill object, and then now whatever I do, I've filled it with this particular material, and whatever I do from here on out, I should be able to see these changes within here. So there is this thing for spherical that's going to change the way that this how it reflects onto the object, and I've noticed, and I think that was set to about 20 for what I put on there. You've got this reflected curve on here, so you can kind of play around with the way that reflection works on the high and mid ends. So if you click and drag a point out, you can get rid of them. So this is maybe what it looks like, just this linear kind of curve. If you click a point and add it in here, it's going to add a nice soft kind of curve to it. If you hold on to it and click and drag out and then drag back in, it makes a really tight point. So if I add another one, it's going to be soft. If I click and drag and hold out and then go out and then come back in, makes another really tight kind of point on here like that. So you could play around with this curve a little bit if you want to see about potentially changing the way that it reflects onto the object that way. And you can kind of see what's going on in the little icon in here. I think the bigger test is just seeing what it actually produces on the model itself. And it feels like when we build a curve like this, it's reducing some reflectivity on the way that the normals kind of face the camera, and as it faces away from the camera, it gets maybe a little bit more reflective at that point, like that. You can also take this and we could do flip horizontal, so you could flip the curve the other way if you wanted. So you could do it that. You can do flip vertical as well. So you might try some different models that way. And what I'm trying to avoid is super saturation on here. I want to see some of the metal within there, so I think I'm gonna do something like this, and then we can close this curve back up. I don't think there was tons that was going on with this, so you can play around with these sliders too for this sub reflection and then this add reflection. This is the one that didn't do too much, but this sub reflection actually seemed to matter quite a bit. So that's going to give you some options for the reflectivity part of it. Now this part on here, the second slot, is going to have a lot of controls on here for so if you do ambient, you can make it feel like it's lit quite a bit without lighting information. I wouldn't pump that up too much, So I think I had that on 1. Diffuse, you can make it darker, you can make it lighter like this. I think normally diffuse is set to around 80% on there. There's also a curve for diffuse, so you can kind of play around with that. Just the same thing that we did and we looked at with reflectivity on this. So if I clicked reset, let's just drag these out and make it linear at that point. And you can see how we could kind of drag it this way or this way. So I kind of like it a little bit more dipped in the middle like that. I'll close that curve back up. We've got specular amount, so we can push this down so there's not very much spec. If we're going to do a metallic surface, it should have a high specular value on here. If we go to the curve for this, you can see I kind of played around with this. This little dip right here built a little bit of specular around the outer part, and then we've got a really steep curve going from nothing to something here. So that makes a really tight kind of highlight. Again, if we took this and then drag all these points out, and I can show you how we can kind of build this up. This is just what the specular looks like from a linear standpoint. And if we just click and drag one point out and then kind of get it in through here, you can see if we add another point, we can get this, we can get some kind of control of this where the specular is really kind of tight, smaller. What I was doing with this was just building some kind of little section over here, again, to build a little bit of specular highlight that exists within there. So we'll close that back up. Not going to mess with transparency on here, reflectivity. Looks like it's doing a little bit on here. It's not really doing anything that is really helping me quite a bit. I don't know if that's this reflectivity. So this is where it's going to get a little bit dicey, kind of playing around with some of these values. And if I do reflectivity like this, yeah, that's not, I was hoping that was going to reflect into maybe that color, but that's not really doing anything for me. These felt very weird about these colors down here because it was kind of giving me the opposite of maybe what I would expect on things. So sometimes they need to be white and sometimes black. So I don't actually even know with this particular material if it's actually pulling on some of the stuff and using it. So you've got gel shading. So we got that. I think that was set to 1. So you can see it's going to give some different results on there. Color diffuse. If I crank this up, let's just try this. If I put this on red at this point, so that will work. So choosing a color down here for diffuse, and then if we crank up this color diffuse, it'll start to pull from that particular thing. So if you want to color a material a particular way, it could be interesting for you. I think I would rather just leave it on something like that and have it gray, but that's all kind of personal choice. So if I put that down to 0, we've got nothing. If we colorize our specular, looks like we can do that. I don't know if I'd necessarily suggest that. If you want to do like a blue, maybe you can find an appealing color for you. Again, I did show you some ways that we could do that inside of Photoshop as well, so that's possible for you to do that. So Anna's trisect diffuse. Again, I'll let you kind of play around with these. We do have cavity intensity, and I couldn't tell if cavity was actually kind of working with this. I didn't feel like this material was giving me any kind of like really good results with cavity going on here. Some of the other materials that it'll let you fill in the cracks with this cavity color, and there's a lot of options for that. So it doesn't look like that's really kind of working on there. Let's take a look at this Fong Blend Specular, and that is going to change the specular component, and you can see it kind of pushes that around a little bit within there. So maybe you might want to use that and kind of crank that up a little bit. And I couldn't tell if this reflection exposure was really doing it. It didn't seem like that was doing anything. So it really feels to me like a lot of their stuff in their materials is they've got all these slots that are open, and they don't like if they build a material and it doesn't actually use those options, they don't take it out of here. So that's where it becomes kind of confusing. So usually I just got to play around with the values just a little bit and see if that kind of works. Now what I would do, if you want to ever get back to this material, it will save, the material information will save with the project. So that's something to keep in mind. And it'll load up with it. But if you ever want to take this material and you want to load it into another session or a different project, you can save the material and go to the other project and say load material, and you can load that into the other project. So that becomes powerful at that point. So what I did, I just did an overall metal, and then what I did was actually take this red reflect. Now there is a yellow reflect, so you could use either one, but I used the red reflect, and I was filling into these secondary shapes with that. And if we take a look at this material, and we got material open on there, and go to the modifiers, this has only got one slot on here for that. What I did for this one, I'm trying to see where we're actually able to give a saturation on here. So I'm trying to see on this one. So we got a cavity. I know we can make it monochromatic like this, but I was trying to see, I know I took one of these and then cranked it up a little bit. Actually, I understand what was going on here. I didn't use the reflect orange. I actually had this reflect red, and this is where I changed one of the values on this. So it actually starts off as red, and you can see on this one I just took the hue of that, and I was able to push that around, so I get a nice reflected material that's nice and saturated. But you can take this hue for A and you can kind of push it around. So I took that and then just pushed it more of like an orange, like let's say within through there, somewhere around there, and then just filled that with that material type. And then at that point, yeah, it's able to just do a secondary material on there for everything. And I'll put it on this, and with those combinations together, I built what I felt was a pretty good combination for some highly reflective metal that looks pretty decent, and then a secondary color that just is kind of a little bit of an accent color to things. Okay, so I know for this video that's throwing a lot of information at you, but I wanted to just wrap everything up and make sure you had all the tools at your disposal to do the same exact type of work that I'm doing here. And you can see the final results that I have, and I brought this into Photoshop and tried to choose an appealing layout that worked on most people's computers for a 16:9 aspect ratio. And so I found that being able to take the sculpt that I have and laying out 3 different versions of it and getting a few different camera vantage points on there was a nice little layout for things, and it displays the work pretty professionally. And then at the end, I was just doing a really kind of very subtle bar at the very bottom and trying to introduce my name and the name of the project at the bottom right, and not do anything that was too distracting and taking away from the artwork. So just kind of ghosting that information back just a little bit. But hopefully you can see with everything that we've learned from the stone project and then now this metal project that you can start thinking about different material types, how you can think about primary, secondary, tertiary forms, pulling all that together. Start thinking about how you could add some color information to your models, be able to do nice different renders, store camera information, and then just show your work off in a professional way. So this should give you all the different tools to get yourself to be creative, make your own kind of shapes, make your own kind of projects, and then have a lot of fun designing and sculpting. So in closing, I'd like to just say thank you for taking the time to go through this series with me. I hope that I've showed you enough to kind of get you to be creative and start making your own ideas and your own projects. And I really want to encourage you to digital sculpt. It's one of my favorite aspects of creating art, and I hope it becomes one of yours as well.